you for coming in 2 minutes. 2 minutes, yeah. The Boldon lecture will begin. Lecture in English, but narration in Armenian will be visible. Dear friends, we start the lecture on mobility in art, education, and change making. Let me introduce Alan Boldon. Alan Boldon is the founder and director of the RAI and the managing director of Darkness Trust. And as an artist, he has exhibited throughout all the world, I think. Yeah. Alan, can we get started?
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to just wait until some people come in. So, yeah, really great to be here, and thanks to Anna and Silan for the invitation, and for the Institute of Contemporary Arts for hosting. So, really great to be here. A couple of months ago, I was talking with Anna about vulnerability, and I think it was even before it was really confirmed that the theme of the festival would be vulnerability. But I was talking about how many of my projects involve collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, and that collaboration works best, I think, if people are prepared to be vulnerable and to push to the edges of their thinking, their practice, their discipline, and be prepared to look beyond that. So, and I talked about a project that I curated, I think maybe 10 years ago. And it was a series of 3 projects, 3 with the same curatorial concept. And so Anna was interested in this, so effectively that's why I'm here and what I'm going to present. But I'm going to say a little bit more about how that project came into being, a little bit more about my work history, and I'm going to just drop in little bits of philosophy and poetry that are part of my constant thinking and reflection. So that's what we're going to do. There's about 133 slides, but I think we'll get through them because most of them is just almost like an animation. So, yeah, tiny bit of history. So I'm an artist, but very early on in my artistic life, I became very much focused on social and economic challenges, and so I was very socially and politically motivated. And I won't go into the whole history, but I got invited to Luxembourg to do some artwork for an international youth project. And the project became a catalyst for almost everything that you'll see. So it was a project to promote intercultural learning amongst low-income creative people from around the world. Is everything all right, technically?
Seems that there is a problem with the
translation.
Okay, I'll wait.
The signal transmission.
Yeah, are we working? No, still not working? Shaking heads. So, technical problem? Yeah. If you can read English, that's a very nice poem from Ursula Le Guin about vulnerability. Continue? Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, we're back. So, we'll come back to Ursula Le Guin. So anyway, I was invited to Luxembourg to do this project. At the time, I was working to establish a political comedy club in London in the 80s, so I was quite involved with that. But the invitation to Luxembourg was very interesting. And so I went out, and basically a job was created for me by the government. This was back in the early 90s, so I was in my early 20s. And a job was created for me as an artist to work between the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Culture, and Health and Social Care Services. And my role was to create artistic projects in every kind of social and healthcare institution you can imagine. So I was doing that. But alongside this, I took over the project that I'd been invited to join. And this project became a kind of lab for me. So effectively, I had the opportunity to invite artists from around Europe and to bring together around 100 creative young people from all over the world. And we started to test out a concept in a way, again, a curatorial concept. I asked artists who had a form of practice which was about engaging with place or places. And I combined artists, and I tested out something which became a kind of curatorial and pedagogic strategy. Effectively, I just asked one artist to find out about the place through their practice, and for the other artist to participate. So they joined and in a way tried to inhabit the method or the approach or the practice of the other. And then they would swap, and the other artist or designer would engage with the same place. And basically, both practices would be usually brilliant, because I was lucky enough to work with brilliant people. But different facets or qualities or properties of the place would be revealed. So we started to look at the potential for interdisciplinary approaches to the complexity of places. So I didn't use that language back then, we were just exploring. The young people were embedded in that process, and so the young people who joined got to participate in 3 partnerships, so they had a really rich engagement with different creative techniques, different ways of engaging with context, with place, and with complexity. So this became a big part of my my own education. I ran that project for 12 years, and it became a kind of lab also for me to work with new people. So I invited, when I encountered interesting artists or designers or eventually ecologists and economists and social theorists to participate in this project. It was a space for me to test out collaboration. In my other work for the government and for social and healthcare services, I was trying to look at social and economic challenges. And very early on, I tried to introduce an environmental agenda to really look at an integrated approach to social, environmental, and economic challenges. So that's where we get into a discussion about collaboration and vulnerability, because I was bringing people together who were experts, but sometimes the role of an expert in revealing the complexity of place is very partial, very limited. So it might be that they have a very advanced practice, but as you bring many different ways of knowing together, you realise how partial that perspective is. It only reveals a very small part of complexity. So there's a kind of, you're kind of exposed, even though you're maybe someone with a very developed practice, real expertise, the limitations of your practice are revealed. If you can sort of submit to that, the potential is tremendous. Because you can start to imagine forms of hybrid collaboration, hybrid practice, and different ways to bring a complex array of ways of knowing together to engage with the wondrous complexity of our world. So that became my project, really, was to try and reveal complexity and to explore how to facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration. So just, I said I'd drop in a few quotes. I hope they inspire you as much as they do me. This is from Ursula Le Guin, one of my favourite writers. So she talks about vulnerability. I don't want a new heaven and new earth, only the old ones. Old sky, old dirt, new grass. Nor life beyond the grave. God help me, or I'll help myself by living all these lives, 9 at once or 90, so that death finds me at all times and on all sides, exposed, unfortressed, undefended, inviolable, vulnerable, alive. So you'll hear from a number of people throughout this presentation talking about vulnerability as a way of being fully alive. In fact, I'll refer to a psychotherapist, Steffi Bednarek, who says that our hearts need to break in many ways for us to feel some of the challenges that people and communities, the world is going through, and then beauty can also flood in. But if we're defended or fortressed, as Ursula Le Guin says, if we push away our vulnerability, we won't be open to that wondrous complexity and that beauty. Okay. So, just going to introduce a key thinker for me, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and hope that the projection stays. And talk about it very briefly about one artwork that I think was a really important artwork for me. I'll talk about the artwork first. So, if you don't know the artist, Jeremy Deller, British artist, and he made a piece of work called The Battle of Aubrey. I don't expect people to know British industrial history, so I'll just briefly explain. So in the 1980s, the British government, the right-wing government, decided to close the mines. So in fact, Britain would continue to buy coal from other countries for many years. So in many ways, it was a political act to try and kill the unions. So the unions in the mining industry were very strong. So it was decided to close most of mining in the UK. And it became a real battle between working people and the government. And it all built to a head on one day where there was a particular mine in South Yorkshire, Aubrey, was the town. And thousands of miners were there demonstrating against the closure of the mines, and the police from all around the country were brought in. So they weren't just local police, there were police from all over the country, and there was this big battle. It was quite a vicious battle, and it was, a terrible day in many ways in the history of the country. So Jeremy's a similar age to me, so this is happening in the 80s. He's a teenager, and he realised that this really important political event, he'd only really experienced it through the press. And most of the press in Britain are right-wing press, so there was a particular way of telling the story. So we only really encountered this story through the media. And he wanted to find out more about what happened that day. So, I think over 2 years, he just started to visit. And although his politics are of the left, he tried to just put that to one side and, in a spirit of complete openness, just started to talk to the miners and to say what happened that day. and just to listen. So to listen with an open heart, with an open mind. And as he started to piece together the story with these miners, he realized he had to speak to the police. He had to speak to the politicians. Another technical problem? Okay. It's just waiting on people to understand it. Yeah. Well, anyway, I can continue speaking if that's right. He started to speak to the police, to the Yorkshire police, to the police that had been flown in from other parts of the country, to the union leaders, to the politicians, and some really fascinating things were revealed about how we all carry stories with us that help give coherence to our identity, to our place in the world. And that sometimes when those stories are challenged, it can be very difficult, but maybe really important. So eventually, after 2 years, are we? Sorry about this, everybody. Yeah, okay. Shall I start again or see if it will work? Okay. No. I can't see anything. Hang on, I'll restart. Okay. Hopefully that's the end of the technical problems. So these stories, eventually after 2 years of collecting the stories, Jeremy decided to make a film about the whole process. He enlisted a filmmaker, Mike Biggis, to make the film, but they also decided that they'd found out quite a lot about what had happened, but they really needed to try something else to really reconstruct a more accurate version of what had happened. So they decided to recreate the battle. So 2,000 people gathered one day, and there were lots of the miners, some of the police, I believe, and historical reenactment societies also joined, and they recreated the battle. And I think if you get the chance to watch the film, I'd really recommend it, but there'll be a couple of moments that I would really point to. So there's a moment where one of the young miners is thinking back on what happened, and it was a really traumatic event for the individuals, for the communities, and for the families. And the miner, is talking about this. He's sitting next to his friend, his mate, and he said, "Yeah, you remember the police were coming down the road, and we had to go behind that van and across the garden, and that's how we could get away." And his friend's looking slightly puzzled. And his friend said, "No, do you not remember? We couldn't go that way because it was blocked. We had to go the other way." And it's a small, in some ways unimportant detail. But you can see that any challenge to the story is really difficult for the people. So they have to start to reconstruct a more accurate story. And to do that, they need many people. So they've been holding on to a story from a very traumatic event, and they realize that it's not accurate, and they need to know more. So this process was a kind of act of, in a way, community healing, and it was also an opportunity for people to reflect on the role of the people that they'd seen as the enemy, because they really needed their stories as well to get a fuller picture of what happened. So, yeah, in a way, I think this is a project which tells us about stories that connect, stories that separate, stories that motivate, and stories that alienate, and about how these stories are established and maintained. So in this case, before this artwork, the story was told in the archive of newspapers, and it was a very, very narrow version of the truth. There's a great artwork downstairs looking at TikTok culture, Recommend people going and have a look at that as well. But again, you'll see, a great version of an inquiry looking at how stories are established, how identities are formed, and how these are now shared and reproduced on TikTok. So one of the ways that our sense of what the world is and what our identity is established. So before I move on, I just want to talk about Hans-Georg Gadamer briefly, if you don't know him, a philosopher. And he says that when we meet another person, the first thing that happens isn't that we have an opportunity to know the other. We would like that maybe to happen, but he says it's more complicated. Effectively what he says is, in the moment when you say something and it jars with the other person, it doesn't quite fit with their world, and they play something back, and that doesn't fit with the way you see the world, so there's a misalignment. He says this is an opportunity not to know the other, but first of all for you to, through the comparison, through the contrast with the other, you can get to know something of how your worldview has been constructed, how it's been put in place. So that's the first thing that can happen. When you meet another, you don't get to know them, but they give you the opportunity, through a misalignment of views, to know something about how your worldview is put together. And he describes all of our learning, all of our ways of knowing as our prejudices. So from everything that we think is just normal, common sense, what we've found out about ourselves and our friends on TikTok, even all the way to our postdoctoral research. He calls all of that prejudices. These are the frames that we use to encounter and understand the world. So when we meet another, we have the chance to see how that's all been put in place, how it's been constructed. After that, he says we do have an opportunity, maybe, if the other person has done the same work, to meet the other and to have what he calls a fusion of horizons. So I think it's an important idea for me. It says that meeting the other is not straightforward. It says that collaboration is not straightforward, it's not simple, but the potential, the value of really going into a deep process is rich and vital. So, okay. Just wanted to show another artwork that's disappeared. Okay. Well, I'll just drop in just a couple of other quotes. So, if you don't know Joseph Boyd's work, Show Me Your Wound, quite an old artwork, but this was, I think you'll recognise, quite close to what I've just been saying. So Joseph Boyd's important German artist, 20th century. He made this work, Show Me Your Wound, and I won't say a lot about it, but look it up. But effectively what Boyd was saying was, he thought art, to a large extent, was about revealing the wounds of society, and that was a kind of therapeutic process. And he thought as well, to meet the other, one had to be vulnerable. So again, I think it speaks to the theme of this conference. One had to show one's weakness, one's wounds. And if the other did that too, then again, coming together was possible. And I always like to read Mary Oliver just because she's just such a gorgeous poet. So I think this speaks as well to something about vulnerability. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. I'm not going to interpret poetry, but that speaks to me beautifully about something I'll also come to about connection with the natural world. And as the Buddhist masters Thich Nhat Hanh said, we are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness. as well. Okay, one more quote and then we'll get into two more artworks. So, in the facilitating of interdisciplinary collaboration, another important idea for me is looking at how to inhabit an uncertain space. So often when we're engaged with complexity, we can work with brilliant people who offer us an insight, but hopefully you've gathered from what I've said so far that will only ever be a partial insight. So we need to hold that very lightly and then bring in other ways of knowing, and slowly and carefully start to think about how we can combine different ways of knowing. So there's a state of staying in uncertainty, which is absolutely vital in interdisciplinary collaboration. So I think Rainer Maria Rilke says it beautifully, as does Keats. So Keats, in a letter, wrote about negative capability, which he says is when a person is capable of being in uncertainties, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. I think we'll all be familiar with the promise or the seduction of false certainty. So staying in a position of uncertainty is very uncomfortable, very difficult. And a literalist or fundamentalist perspective is to collapse uncertainty and offer false certainty because it offers security. So the work that I'm doing is very often about trying to hold open this space of uncertainty. So, or as Rilke says, much better than I can, this was a letter to a young poet. I would like to beg you, dear sir, as well as I can, to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and to try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers, which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live in them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer. Okay, another artwork. I'm just going to show you a brief film that was made to promote this piece. This is an artwork that I encountered at MIT a few years ago. So Karim Ben Khalifa is a war correspondent, and as I think you'll hear in the film, he'd been in some of the most challenging places in the world. He became a father, and he no longer felt it was responsible for him to put himself in such danger. But he still felt that he wanted to know more about war and conflict and why it happened. So I just have to see if this works technically. So what he did was he went around the world. He went into conflict areas like the Gaza Strip. He went into the Democratic Republic of Congo. He went into El Salvador, and he met gang leaders, warlords, military, freedom fighters. But very often what he did was find someone that he could speak to and then find their enemy. And he would have the same conversation with them. And they're recorded, and the VR artwork that you then can experience, what happens is you put on a VR headset, you walk into the room, and you see a picture, let's say, of the Gaza Strip. As you walk towards the image, an Israeli soldier walks towards you and starts to talk about their fears, their thoughts about the enemy, their hopes for the future. And then if you look around, you can see a freedom fighter, a Palestinian freedom fighter, and you can walk towards them, and then they will tell you their story. And the remarkable things that happens is that you hear these actually devastating stories of violence and conflict, but you also hear statements that express a common humanity. So it's a really powerful work, which hopefully we can just get a little glimpse of if this works.
I simply do not know to walk in front of my eyes. Yes, I was in a dark church when this happened. My friends in Israel, when they know I'm heading for Gaza, come help themselves, the Jewish leader, and to stay safe. They believe that other people in Gaza, I have rights to them. Also, when I spend weeks working in Gaza, and I'm about to return to Israel, my Palestinian friends are telling me the exact same thing. Be careful there. The project is rooted in my experience as a war photographer, going from one side of the front line to the other, and finding that the fighters' dreams, hopes, and nightmares are often more similar than they are different. So there is a bigger story than the war itself, and this is the one I want to explore and share. For the enemy, I understood the latest technologies in virtual and augmented realities, so you can engage directly with the combatants and meet them, hear them, and feel them the way I do. In many parts of our world, you create an enemy as a kid, without having met your enemy, because the society around you has created an enemy in the other. So the question is, could I be you if I was on the other side?
I hope you can hear that, but you get a sense of it. So, this, I mean, for me it was very powerful. There was an awful lot of violence in my youth, and being confronted by gang leaders, you talked about the kind of violence that they perpetrated, was really shocking. And also you really feel the threat of the personal presence of these people. But then what comes out, as Ben Khalifa says, is this sense of common humanity. And it's a very powerful artwork. So I couldn't download the app here for some reason, but if you can find a way to look at the work online or download the app somehow. There is an app that allows you to experience the artwork, so I really recommend it. Okay, right to the other stuff.
JR has very similar things. The artist JR,
Okay.
French,
Yeah.
he has very similar work to this.
Yes.
Very similar.
Well, I mean, it's important.
Enemies and allies and
yeah, absolutely. Great. I'm not really enjoying this technological challenge, to be honest, but okay. Okay. So hopefully, this interrupted presentations somehow coherent. You're getting this different views on how we might think about encountering the other, how we might experience different worldviews, and how we might find a common humanity. So out of that work in Luxembourg, a couple of things happened. I invited academics to participate in this work, and effectively what we were doing was, in a couple of weeks, doing some really intensive place-based learning, really intensive interdisciplinary collaboration. And a lot of academics were saying when they came, we're going further in our learning in 2 or 3 weeks than we do in a whole academic year. So I was kind of disappointed to hear that. So when I eventually got involved in academia, I designed quite a lot of degrees on the basis of this program. So it's a strange habit, but I think I've designed 15 postgrad degrees based on this model. And it's a model that came out of it for intensive lab-based interdisciplinary learning. Is a brilliant model in terms of pedagogy, and it's been distributed around the world. So the first program I did, after I left Luxembourg, I joined a place called Dartington, where, because I've been trying to work on this combination of social, economic, and environmental issues, I was a research fellow and we were looking for a title, and we came up entitled Arts and Ecology. So that became a whole definition of the next phase of work. So I designed a master's in Arts and Ecology. And the artist that I mentioned earlier, Jeremy Della, so he was one of the first people to contribute to that program. And effectively, what I did was I went to people like Jeremy and I said, okay, you're a brilliant artist, your form of inquiry is really sophisticated and subtle, but who would you like to learn from? Who would you like to spend time with? And what I found is when I spoke with world-leading economists and designers and engineers and philosophers, they were brilliant because they had endless curiosity and they were pushing to the edge of their practice, pushing to the edge of their way of knowing. And they wanted to know what was outside of that, what was to the side of it, what was beyond that. And very often there were people that they were interested in and they said that they would love to work with. So Jeremy, for instance, he was really fascinated by an activist group called Platform London. I brought Jeremy and Platform London together. Dan Grennan, one of the founders, was absolutely fascinated by Jeremy's practice, and they were both interested in an environmental philosopher, Wallace Hyde. So, just as a for instance, I designed a master's degree as a series of learning labs, and the learning labs allowed me to bring at least 3 practitioners from different worlds together. So one of the learning labs was with Jeremy Della, Dan Grant from Platform London, and Wallace Hyde, and the practice was for them to introduce us to the place we were in, Dartington, and to take turns doing that, and to explore how they could start to combine their different ways of knowing. So you can start to see, hopefully, from these experiments, something resolving into a practice. So that was a practice that I employed very often in academia, designing these learning programs. Another thing that I did there, and this is the artwork that I talked about with Anna, that kind of brought me here. So I curated a series of experiments in collaboration in a gallery, and it was partly because I'm also a curator, and I would go into artist studios, and I would see work just starting to emerge, or at a critical point where it could go in a number of different directions. And very often I found that more interesting than the final work, when lots of possibilities have been collapsed into a finished piece. And there's even a bit of aesthetic theory which talks about the unfinished work being more inviting and engaging to the imagination. A usual example used is, a Michelangelo Pieta. One of his last works, you can just see Christ and Mary emerging from the stone, but it's an unfinished piece. If you look at it alongside a finished piece, all of the work's done for you. It's still, brilliant to see a finished piece of work. But an unfinished piece, you have to imagine what the next stages will be. So it really invites the imagination. And as a curator, I've often then tried to curate work which in a way isn't quite finished, which could still go into a number of directions, because I think that really engages audiences in co-creating with me, in completing the work in lots of different ways. So this gallery project was an attempt to sort of perform live collaboration between artists. So what I asked the artists to do, this is a list of the artists and the order that they were going to enter a gallery. We had an empty gallery, and the first artist would go in, and I asked them to go in with nothing, to arrive with nothing, knowing that that's more or less impossible. So they could go in without carrying anything, but the idea was that they would then try to put to one side their usual habits of thinking and making. That's impossible, but it was going to be one of those experiments of being confronted with our habits. So the artist would then make an intervention into the gallery in 24 hours. Then they would leave, and the gallery would be open to the public for 24 hours. The work was documented, and it appeared next door as the first piece of an archive showing the process. The second artist went in, and whatever was their material. So they could add to it, they could destroy it, they could remove it. So we had to come up with we had to discuss this a lot in advance, but people understood the process, that their work was going to be potentially destroyed. But effectively, you would be arriving and finding material that would be very unfamiliar. So again, it was trying to get people to explore their habits, their patterns of making, and unsettle that, disturb that. They would then make a piece of work in 24 hours. Again, that was documented and archive built up. And then the third artist, and so on. And we went through 2 cycles so that you kind of received from one artist and handed on to another artist in a different order. So I'm going to show you at some pace the documentation of the process. So hopefully that makes sense. It's not a complicated concept, but not necessarily straightforward to describe. So this is just the empty gallery before everybody's gone in. So Richard Bond, the first artist, he walked into that room and that's what he found. And he made a very simple intervention. He wove a wall of paper, very thin newsprint paper, and there's wooden buttons, sort of floor to ceiling, wall to wall, so it's absolutely sealed, so half the gallery disappeared. And there was a light behind, and that was it. So it was a quite clearly a very fragile wall, but one that meant that half the gallery had gone. So the next artist in, one of them was myself. I decided to combine with another artist called Vlad Fryer. We just made some incisions into the piece of, into the paper wall. We lifted the fixing on the floor and moved it back so there was a curvature. And we had an exchange between ourselves, drawing on the walls, where we were taking turns in a kind of dialogue in drawing, so that the audience could kind of just peek through the wall, the paper wall, and see this kind of drawing exchange that had happened. The next person was a choreographer, quite a well-known, famous choreographer called Emmeline Clade. Emmeline had just had a book about her life's work rejected by a publisher. So she was quite upset, so she put the whole manuscript through a shredder. So the whole work was destroyed. So what you're seeing on the floor there is a destroyed book from her life's work. So it was kind of thrown through the gallery. And Emmeline decided basically to perform for about 12 hours in this gallery. And you could just see her just through the gaps in the torn or cut paper. And you can see that she more or less starts to wear the artworks through rubbing against the walls. Very occasionally she came in. So then, after that, the writer, curator, and artist Tracy Moore came in. If you're familiar with art science writing, Tracy's probably one of the most important and prolific writers on art science collaboration. So Tracy made a nest out of the book. She drank a bottle of wine. She reflected on the process, and then she strapped a video recorder to her head and had a dictaphone, and she went for a walk. And basically told a story about this kind of collaboration. And when she got back, she transcribed the story and made a book. And when you arrived at the gallery, you could go and sit and say nest, and you could find and listen to the recording, you could watch the video, or you could read the book. This was all in 24 hours, so that's pretty impressive to write a book in 24 hours. The next artist in was Chris Crickmay, sculptor and architect. And he read the book and he identified every object that was mentioned in the book, and then he tried in 24 hours to find those objects and bring them into the gallery. He also, as you can see, got very bored of the paper wall, so he wrapped it up and tied it up with rope. And so that's what's remaining of the paper wall. But there were things like in Tracy's book, she'd mentioned a length of rope, a string vest, a pound of butter, a doodle bug, a horse. All of these objects were listed and he basically sourced them. After that, Richard Boldon came back in, the guy who originally made the wall, and he was really not interested in that piece of paper anymore, so he took it out and burnt it. We did video record the burning, and then at the end, it was such an interesting shape, it was like a carcass, so it had to come back in. So it had gone out, been destroyed, and then it was back in. But effectively, you can see that the elements kind of move in and out, they're transformed, they take on different identities in the way that they're constellated in relationship to each other. There was an interesting moment at this point, so this is when the audience come in one of the gaps. And so there was a point at which these two kids came in, and they're the kids of, there's a famous English poet called Alice Oswald, and that's her playwright husband, Peter Oswald, and that's their kids. And one of the kids said to me about the little matchbox with the doodlebug on. They said, "Oh, who did that bit? Who did that bit?" And, you don't want to bullshit a kid. But, so I wanted to sort of say, well, Chris Crickmay put it there, but he only put it there because Tracy wrote the story, and Tracy only wrote the story because what Emily did. Kid got bored, obviously, and just wandered off, I understand. But there was a Chinese curator visiting at the time, Zhang Wei, and she was listening in on this, and she said, "Oh, that was really interesting," because she grew up in a contemporary arts kind of world, but also living a version of Chinese communism, a very different notion of identity, notion of the individual and the collective, and of creativity. And she said, she recognized, it was an interesting comment, she recognized a sort of notion of collective creativity that was being explored. Anyway, I'm just going to rush through these final changes. So we each had another turn. There was a point at which I think, let's find it. Yeah, Richard Bond drilled through this door that had appeared, and he put these little lenses in where you can see through, like security lenses. And Emmeline Clay really wanted to photograph his body, so you could look through and just see little fragments of his body. Tracy Moore, inspired in a way by Paul Clay, taking a line on a walk, took a line of text on a walk around the gallery. So we finished up with these curious juxtapositions of text and object. So she's kind of weaving the parts together. And then this is Glad, and Glad came back, and he decided to wash the walls, and the marks that was making became a new painting. And that's me before my hair went white. And you can still read this as a text from this destroyed book. So it was kind of a futile attempt, but I thought I'd try and put the book back together. So I started to make long lines of text, and then to weave them together so you can see a kind of woven wall of text. And because of these little lenses, you could look through the wall and just see a little bit of the lines of text. So, as I say, I was sad about that book somehow. I was trying to put it back together. So that, I think, is the final iteration, and then there was a kind of magic moment at the end. So we had to this is Evelyn, just in the sort of reddish shirt. And there was a lovely moment in the private view where she got a phone call, and it was a different publisher, to say that they were going to publish her book. And it did feel kind of magic that we kind of been through this process of destroying the work and casting it out in the world, and somehow bringing it back together, and maybe there was some magic in there. Maybe it was just that it was a great book and it really needed to be published. But, anyway, and then we sat in the outback and discussed collaboration. And really, it was for all of us who participated, there was at least a little bit of this thing of we all had different ways of making habits that were quite refined, I would like to think, and I would certainly say that of the others. But we were confronted with very different material, very different starting points. So it did really throw us back at our habits, at our prejudices, and asked us to think about why we'd become the kind of makers we were. So it was a really interesting experiment. We did this 3 times, and I'm just about to curate the 4th iteration. So, but with a wider range of people, so not just artists. Well, I had a role at the university as head of research, and I started a thing called the Research Gallery, and I got very excited about curating mathematicians, physicists, and trying to find ways not just to illustrate their work or communicate their work, but think about their work as material that could then be curated into an interesting exhibition. So, yeah, so that's another thing that's informing my current work. Yeah, so just a couple of things I wanted to mention before I come to the more or less the final piece. So these collaborations between artists, economists, designers, philosophers, in the learning labs of the master's degree that I designed, or in these exhibitions that I curated, what started to happen was that we did find that there were emerging collaborations, and emerging partnerships, where people wanted to find out where this could go. So we actually started to, in a way, in the language of business, we started to spin out possibilities. So we took on work for cities on placemaking, where we could bring together some of the artists, the architects, the engineers, the economists, who were really interested in thinking in very fresh ways about city design, urban planning, economic development, community building, and trying to do that in a way where it's done currently is very segmented, very, sort of, what would be the right word? Well, segmented, sort of split apart, rather than really sort of understanding the complexity of designing a place. So we started to do that, worked with quite a number of cities. We also started to take on strategy work, so developed a strategy for Tate on how Tate would become an ecological organisation, so I led that work. Took on a strategy for a number of businesses, and effectively what we were starting to feel out was how organisations, big cultural organisations, businesses, who were all facing complex challenges, back to that early work, that had social, economic, and ecological dimensions, they were becoming more and more ready to admit that they couldn't really engage with the whole. They could only engage with parts. So the work became very much about how do we look at integrated approaches to complex challenges. And that's very much what I'm doing now. So effectively what I did after a number of these projects was I created a company called Weave, and we've been prototyping a portfolio of programs. One is, I'll come back to just say what these are, but there's a program called the Imagination Residencies. We've developed an approach to regional leadership development and Changemaker Summer Schools. So in some ways what we're doing is repurposing some of the projects that you've seen, sort of putting them together to create a coherent portfolio to engage with the complexities of a bioregion. Just a couple of things just to say why that might be interesting. This is from a book called Where Good Ideas Come From, Stephen Johnson. I think it's quite a neat slide. He's basically kind of saying, if you go back 60,000 BC, you get boats, move on a little bit, you get bows and arrows, you get mining. So these innovations are happening. When you get to the point where we start to have cities, it's not just cities, it's trade routes and all sorts of points of exchange, but where you have this concentration of people, basically you get a massive explosion of innovation. And what he talks about, he describes it as a feature of the adjacent possible. I don't know if you know this concept, but if you've got A, B, C, D, and in fact, astrophysicists will tell you about this. At the very start of the universe, you might have 4 elements, but the moment you have A, B, C, and D, you have the possibility of AB, AC, AD, BC, etc. The moment they come into being, because it's in the nature of the universe to create that which is possible, you start to get the next line, A, B, A, C, A, B, etc. So this is about proximity, many different elements combining to generate new possibilities. So it's a concept called the adjacent possible. And as Stephen Johnson says, in terms of his theory of innovation, the trick to having good ideas is not to sit around in glorious isolation and try to think big thoughts. The trick is to get more pumps on the table. If any of you have seen the film Oppenheimer, you'll have seen the necessity of bringing many different people together with very different perspectives. No one person could have developed what was clearly a terrible innovation, but no one person could have developed it. It required multiple forms of intelligence, finding new ways of combining what they were. So a version of the adjacent possible. So where am I now? Well, so with this company, we effectively what we are saying. This is the what we're saying is that we are in a period of unprecedented crisis, climate crisis, obscene inequality and inequity in many parts of the world, most of the world, I would say, mass biodiversity loss, horrendous systemic misogyny, war and conflict. And we need to find new ways of engaging with these challenges. And I think back to the theme of the conference, the festival, I think one of the ways towards these kinds of forms of collaboration is to admit to our vulnerability, to hold uncertainty in the ways that I've talked about very lightly, and to explore combining different ways of knowing. I'd just like to drop in a couple of other thoughts. There's a neuroscientist called Ian McGilchrist, and again I recommend you look at his work. So he was a very well-established, even famous neuroscientist, and he saw that there were so many popular psychology books about the left and right hemisphere of the brain, and he thought, well, it's kind of career suicide for someone like me to write this book, but someone needs to write an informed version of the difference, the very important difference between the left and the right hemisphere. So he wrote this book, and it's called The Master and His Hemisphere. And he gives an example of how the hemispheres work in very different ways in terms of pattern recognition. So if you've got a bird, and it's got some seed on the ground, and let's say it's a seed amongst a load of pebbles. So it could be quite hard to identify the seed. So the left hemisphere is brilliant at a particular form of pattern recognition. It can zoom in on the seeds, and it's absolutely focused on that. So very targeted identification of that which is known already is what it's good at. The right hemisphere is scanning the environment, also engaged in pattern recognition, also engaged to an extent in looking for the familiar, a predator, a hawk, or something like that. So capable of doing that, but it also has this remarkable capacity, which is to identify unknown, unfamiliar forms, and not to collapse them into recognizable forms. So it could see a shape that's quite like a hawk, but not collapse uncertainty falsely and say it's a hawk. It's capable of holding those forms in a kind of liminal space, not yet deciding what it is. So it's an absolutely critical feature of the right hemisphere thinking. And as he will say, that both hemispheres are working together all the time. And there's a rapid oscillation between different kinds of knowing. He makes a devastating statement there. He says that currently what he sees is that the left hemisphere is making the world in its own image. So there's a kind of literalism, a kind of collapsing of uncertainty into absolute known forms, and a reproduction of that. Memes, social media identities, these are kinds of versions of that. Fundamentalism, an absolute sort of wall being put up between us and them. This is left hemisphere thinking. And he says basically we need the left hemisphere because it's brilliant forms of pattern recognition. But what's happening is this devastating split. He's now produced another book where he says we need to move between four kinds of knowing. the rational, the logical, the imaginative, and the intuitive, and to move constantly between those. And this, for him, is a way to do two things. One is, he says, it may be a way to approach the sublime, even the divine, he says. And as far as he's concerned, it's only in opening one's heart, in moving between different ways of knowing, that we will properly reconnect with each other, with the wondrous complexity of our world, and from that place be potentially capable of engaging with the problems that we're facing. The alternative is devastating. He quotes John Donne, I think it's a beautiful line in a John Donne poem. He who will approach the hill of truth, about must go. So he says there's no straight line to the truth. It's always circling. And it's his form of circling is circling with these different forms of knowing. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of what you've seen in my approach to things. So what I do is try and bring many people together with different ways of knowing. And I said I'd close just saying what the imagination residencies are going to be. And I'm going to have a tour of the building and the amazing residency facilities here, so maybe we'll go here. But effectively what I'm now doing is curating imagination residencies as the first part of the weave work. We bring people together from very different worlds, and we ask them, I think, an almost impossible question. We ask them to inhabit the other's way of knowing the world. So an economist will be trying to inhabit the world of a physicist, will be trying to inhabit the world of an artist, will be trying to inhabit the world of an urban designer. And effectively, what we're doing at the end of that is drawing out of those intensive collaborations material, which will be diagrams and objects and drawings and bits of text. And we're curating exhibitions that effectively try and represent the dialogue that's emerging and the partnerships that we're going to be encouraging. And then we move into a second phase, which is looking at how we can bring those partnerships to bear on the complex challenges that we're facing. So, there's one other thing, just close with one statement if I can find it. No, there you go. No. Okay, yeah, there it is. I mentioned the psychotherapist Yerevan, who said that our hearts must break for us to do this work. I just want to finish with a quote from James Hillman, American psychotherapist and protege of Carl Gustav Jung. He said, when we're looking to support processes of change, he basically said, statistics don't move anybody. We're looking at trying to affect change in terms of climate crisis, giving people statistics about biodiversity loss, giving people statistics about carbon isn't going to change many people's minds. So he says, the motivation must come from below the superego, from the id of desire. We must first be moved by beauty, but then love is aroused. When you love something, then you want it near, not to be harmed. What evokes love? As has been said in many places and felt by any one of us, it's beauty. Beauty astounds and pulls the heart's focus towards the object. Technical problems plague me today. Beauty astounds and pulls the heart's focus towards the object, out of ourselves, out of this human-centered insanity toward wanting to keep the cosmos there for another spring and another morning. This is ecological emotion, and it is aesthetic and political. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much. There was a lot of stuff. Hopefully, it was a kind of collage, which I haven't done before, so I honestly don't know if that made any sense, but I was trying to just put out some ideas, some bits of practice, other people's practice, bits of mine, and I'm trying to make sense of it, and I'm trying to make sense of it by practicing, by doing stuff. My commitment is always to learn by doing. So you're catching me in a moment when I'm just about to learn by doing some new stuff, and you were kind of hearing about the elements that are in the mix. So, anyway, did any of that make sense? Anyone? Any questions or comments?
I came in late, so sorry about that. Could you be able to post any of the stuff, any of the slides?
Say again?
Can you post any of the slides anywhere?
Post them, I mean, through Silent or something. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to, but
That would be great.
I think the thing, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's going to be a great watch, but I think we've recorded the session, so you'd be able to see that. So, you're going to put yourself through it again? You're going to put yourself through it again?
Well, you know, I've got them half, so.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key idea was this thing about the difficulty, but also the incredible possibility of meeting another. And how, you know, when you see the devastating work from Karim Ben Khalifa, you know, when that doesn't happen, how that is at the root of conflict. But even exciting things like collaboration. It's not straightforward, but, you know, anybody who's been part of a great collaboration knows the immense value. I mean, I know lots of people here are. And well, you talked yesterday, Patricia, about it. I mean, did that make sense to you? Yeah. Because you're working with, you know, medical ethicists and surgeons, big, very different worlds.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the whole thing about encountering prejudices and how your worldviews were put together makes sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it made me think as well, because I live in a city with a tremendous amount of racial tension as well, and it's actually where Black Lives Matter launched as a protest movement. So when you add to understanding the other, the whole notion of social justice and retribution and all the rest, it really gets complicated.
Yeah, necessarily complicated.
Yeah, necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I've been focused very much on you know, what you could call ecological justice. And, you know, that basically is saying social justice and ecological justice have to be connected, have to be brought together.
Indeed.
So, yeah.
Were any of those done on cocktail napkins?
Most of it. Yeah, most of it written in the last couple of days.
What is it subject of the curating work in progress? Is the create a schedule of interventions or something other? How was changing the managing the curating the change in the exhibition?
So the exhibition where we how was it curated?
The subject of
the subject
of the curating, the changes and what the driving the change.
So in a way, the subject was collaboration. You know, so we didn't know what anybody was going to make. You know, so Richard Bond, it was a formal intervention, but in a way, it was just like making a statement in a conversation. It was making a statement to see how people would respond, and then to look at how, in this exchange, we would be confronted with our habits. So, you know, my tendency as a visual artist, I have a sort of repertoire of marks, of interests, of subject matter. In this dialogue, that wasn't part of the material. So I could bring it in, but I'd be forcing it in. Or I could work with what was there, or a bit of both. So, and I think that's always what's happening. You're tending to bring in things that you're...
There is no any scenario script.
No script, no. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to see the next person come in to see whether or not if they build upon what was existing before, or completely take it down. That is also very indicative of the psychology of the person who comes in, right?
Yeah. I mean, it might not make sense to talk about it, but we did another version where I think the first intervention was actually a performance artist who made an object, Melanie Thompson, and she had this enormous apron, and so this apron was just sort of hanging from the wall, and it went into a basket, and then there was all of this kind of blood seeping through onto the floor. And I'd just been to Crete. I don't know if you've been to Crete, but you get a lot of these shrines everywhere. When someone's died, there'll be a little wooden shrine, not very big, on legs. And this form reminded me of that. So I responded by making this enormous painting of reproducing the elements that Melanie had brought in. But then Richard Bond, when he came in, he literally made a number of these shrines. So he took my drawing and he made a load of these shrines. So suddenly around the gallery, there were all of these shrines, but they had red paint sort of hidden away, and they were just dripping at very different intervals. So suddenly from one person introducing an element, it really was developed as a theme and sort of amplified. That was very powerful. You just had a little bit of an idea, but through collaboration it became so much more. And to see this apron and this painting of people in conflict and shrines, and then to have all of these shrines, I think there were about 7 or 8 of this dripping blood, just at very different places throughout the gallery. So those moments were beautiful, just to sort of feel your ideas have been met, taken in a new direction that you wouldn't necessarily have done, but in the spirit, and sort of amplified. That can happen.
And the painting becomes a working diagram for the next piece.
Yeah. So, I'd recommend taking part in such a thing. It's very interesting. You're up for it?
I'll come. I hope
Okay.
to, yeah.
Good. Well, thanks very much for coming and for listening so attentively. Sorry about the technical stuff. It's part of my computer.